So I have some great news. I am the last speaker. That is unfortunately bad news for me because I've had to sit through amazing presentations where I kept on saying, oh crap, they said exactly what I was about to say. But hopefully, what I will share today will start to talk about how some of all of that can come together and how we can think about some of the many issues and opportunities that we discussed today from a design perspective. So I'm an architect. And as an architect, a lot of my training really focused on how to make better spaces, how to make better buildings, how to create more sustainable places in which we can work. And when I go into meetings sometimes, people look at me as, okay, you're the architect in the room, you're going to tell us how much space we have, you're going to tell us how much furniture we can squeeze in. But that's never really quite sat right with me in terms of understanding what it is that I'm supposed to do. And I often like showing this image and when I give talks, because to me it kind of started to point at what's the challenge when we start to think about shaping space in a really narrow way. So this is an abandoned library in Camden, New Jersey. And a lot of times when we talk about sustainability, we talk about it from the lens of how can we create healthier environments? How can we make sure that we remove the damage that we as human beings do to our natural environment and make sure that it comes back? So if we look at this picture, we might say that this is a success story. There is a rich, verdant green tree growing in the midst of this rubble. That's successful. But I don't think any of us looking at this would call this a success. I think we might actually ask, where are the people? What happened to this community? It is most certainly not thriving. And so in my work, I start to think about that question of where are the people? And how do we think about acts of architecture and design from the lens of the people? Because if we start to think about what makes a house a home, or what makes a school a place of learning and inspiration, or what makes a community center the center of a community, or an open space a place of joy and play. It's always about the people. And this is, of course, something that many speakers have talked about today. And what I want to show you through the work that I'm about to present is this idea of how can we actually put that into implementation of the stuff that we see on the ground. How can we talk about this act of creation coming from a human-centered lens, a human-centered design? And so I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I think are instrumental to that idea of human-centered design. The first is this idea of the system, or how can we think beyond the object. So if I go in and a client tells me that the end goal is to create a building, it often seems like it misses so much, because a lot of what we're talking about are communities that are hurting, but where there is a lot of opportunity. And in order to understand that, we have to go back to the heart, back to the people who live in those communities. But we also have to think of the design project as not just being the building, but everything that makes that community thrive, everything that makes it worth living. And so that's looking at things like economic empowerment, social cohesion, and making that the project. And that often means that we're bringing a lot of different people to the table, and we're thinking about each piece in the act of creation from a holistic level. So I'm wrapping up work right now on a master plan for a low-income, affordable housing community in Charlottesville, Virginia. And as part of the redevelopment, its Section 8 property has never been touched with a significant redevelopment in the 40 years that it's existed. And so part of the funding strategy to make it work is to actually turn it into a mixed income community. And so when we went in, we decided we weren't going to start off with charrette sessions to say, okay, residents, what do you want to see here? We actually decided that to start with people, we had to meet people individually. And so I spent the first couple months of the project going into the homes of residents. And I didn't go in there saying, okay, together we're going to draw what this thing can be, or give me the list of all the things you wanted to see. I went in and said, I'm here to listen to you. I'm here to learn about you and your life. And that for the hour or 2 hours or however long it ends up being, we're just sitting in conversation. I just want to learn about this place and about what it has been like to live here. And so in those conversations, we heard a lot of stories very similar to Tammy's. Many of these residents said, this was better than public housing, but I really wasn't expecting to be here that long. My aspiration of where I wanted to go was better than this. Yet, when you start thinking about Section 8, that rises and falls with your income, having to pay for daycare, where you're often reliant on subsidies, trying to figure out transportation costs, trying to figure out how do you get a better job and the skills you need to do that, it ended up creating a trap where they were never able to build equity and they were stuck. And so when we talked about how could we create this place in a way that would be better, so for some of them, they were just ready to leave. They couldn't really visualize that this could be better. For others, they were interested in this idea of mixed income because they actually thought with people of higher incomes, you might bring opportunity and that they could get access and that this place would no longer be the ghetto and maybe they could move up. But the reality of the situation is the difference between Section 8 and market rate is actually pretty huge. They would never be able to move up here. And so we started to look at, well, if we said that the outcome of this was not just to redevelop this property, but to actually create increased opportunity, what would that mean? And so that started to feed into the development of a master plan that incorporated many principles that were designed to attack the entire system and make it better for these residents. And so one of the ideas that came up was if we really are talking about this place as a ladder of opportunity, then that means that it can't just have Section 8 and market rate. It actually had to have other levels of affordability within it. If the things we were hearing from people is that some of the challenges of being able to move up were their skills, how are we partnering with folks who provide job training for some of the other parts of the development that were supposed to be mixed use? Or how were we looking at early childhood facilities that could also fill some of those mixed use spaces? All of that meant that we were looking at it as a system and we were looking at who were the partners that needed to be brought on to create this more holistic vision. And it started with just talking from the residents themselves. And so that means that the inputs that we're thinking about aren't just zoning regulations or how much money we have to build or what's the space we're building on, but we're looking at things as what's the economic challenges of the residents, or even what is the displacement legacy and how that impacts the way in which they accept us coming in and the way in which they think about the changes that are going to happen. And we think about what we're creating not in the lens of outputs like the building, but outcomes. Where do you want to go as goals? And that's what thinking in terms of a system is. Specificity is another thing that I think is really important when we talk about this idea of human-centered design. So the last couple of years, we've definitely had what we can say is a lot of rough stories that we've heard. And I was talking to someone recently trying to understand what was it about this moment that just seemed different than, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, because clearly this is not the first time that black men and women have been killed. But I think one of the things that struck me that's different about this moment is that we know their names. We're not just saying the random black man who got murdered unjustly. We're talking about Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland. And there's something about knowing somebody as a name, as a person with a life and an experience, that's different than knowing them as a category. And so in my work, a lot of what I try to do is start to ask the question of how do we move beyond categories? One of the projects that I'm best known for is called the Day Labor Station, and it was one I did a number of years ago before the current craziness that we're in right now. But yet many of the things that we found were quite appropriate. The idea was looking to deploy shelters at informal hiring sites like Home Depot parking lots and gas stations, and our clients were day laborers. And what's really interesting if we talk about the immigration issue is that we either get the positioning on the, let's say, alt-right, where it talks about them as murderers, thieves, rapists. But on the left, sometimes we're not so much better either. That we feel sympathy for them and their plight, but we don't really get into specifics of who they are. If you've hired a day laborer, when was the last time you actually asked them about their actual life? In the case of Roberto, Leobardo, and some of the other day laborers that we met, understanding their life became important for us to understand what it is that we needed to build to make sure that we could make a difference for them. And often when we talked to them, a lot of what they said sounded like core American values. They came here for a better life for themselves and their kids. And for them, these hiring sites were actually sacred. This was a place where they made those dreams possible. And they had actually been able to create quite a bit from those sites. But because they were invisible, they felt that nobody really valued what they did. And so as we thought about what to do, we started to reach into those stories. We also started to understand that not every site was the same. And so it wasn't just about reaching for the stories as a collective, but understanding what was needed at individual corners. So the idea of the project was actually a kit of parts that could be adapted to meet the needs of a given site. So this is an example of a proposal for one in Los Angeles that was supposed to meet 200 workers. And a part of this site also included creating a community garden that could be jointly tended to by the workers and nearby residents as a way to build opportunity for specificity to happen long after we as architects had left the building. Co-power is another important aspect of this idea of building human-centered cities. So I used to use Empower all the time to talk about the work that I do. And it was actually a colleague of mine about a year ago that challenged me to think different. Because they said, Empower often means that there is still a power dynamic at work because we who have power are choosing to give it to those who don't. And it often implies that at some level, somebody is losing and somebody is winning. There is always going to be a give and take. Co-power starts to talk about the idea of what if we thought of our goal as shared power, where we all win because we all benefit. Angela this morning mentioned Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco, which is a community that I'm working in as well. And it's a historic African-American community, one of the largest within the city, but over the last 20 years or so has seen a loss of that population, as she cited. But what's happening now is that it's also seeing a massive gentrification, as many of the industrial sites that populated that neighborhood are now being converted into housing and mixed-use developments. And I'm actually working on one of those sites right now. It's the old power plant site. And what's really interesting about the project is because of the size of it, we are potentially participating in the gentrification that's happening in the neighborhood. And so as people with the power, both my client, the utility company, and myself, there's a certain conversation of how do we create something that actually honors and includes that historic African-American community that's been there. And so as a result, we started thinking about how can we change up the narrative of how space gets created here. I've heard today and also in conversations I had in the lead up to this conference about how overplanned and overstudied things in Pittsburgh feel. This neighborhood had very much the same thing as well. And so we said, instead of holding our charrettes and then coming up with something 6 months, a year down the road, what if we started to make the act of creation actually happen in real time in order to give the most amount of people the opportunity to participate? So instead of having meetings in some hall, we actually started holding events and doing activations on site, like a circus, which freaked my client out, but it was an absolute success. And doing things that would honor people who were not just time-rich, which is generally the people who benefit from the community meetings, but those who were time poor, and making sure that we gave them an opportunity to be able to talk about what they wanted to see here, and that through coming to these events, we set up something that was a benefit to you, that you could come with your family, and that responded to things that we had heard, either that you wanted a place where you could hang out with your community, or you wanted access to job training. We set up all of those things in collaborations with local partners, and then while you were there, we would have different things that would allow you to stake your voice. And that didn't matter what age you were. We have activities for little kids to state their voice. It didn't matter whether you were a resident of the public housing or you're a resident of some of the newer things that came in. But we did try to register and make sure we were always conscious of what the existing community wanted, and making sure that, above all, we were always giving them maximum opportunity, because if we talk about distribution of power, equity also plays a role here too. So some of the newer residents maybe already felt more powerful than the existing residents. And so through creating these events, we were looking for opportunities to make sure that it didn't matter whether you lived in the public housing, you still had a way to make your voice heard. And so with that, it became this idea of changing up the narrative of how we do projects and how we create these opportunities for people to be able to shape the spaces that they're in now, but then also to be able to lay claim of what they wanted to see in the future. And so this is the first piece that's actually going to come on board this winter. And a great portion of the design has actually been shaped by the claiming of space that people have done through all of these events on site, both through their words and through their feet. And making sure that certain stories that tend not to be told, such as that of the African American community, are registered permanently in this site. The final piece I'm going to talk about is empathy. So this morning, Mayor Fisher mentioned this idea of compassion over empathy. And I want to say that maybe it should be compassion over sympathy. I think empathy and sympathy often get confused. Sympathy is that emotional reaction when you feel bad for the homeless person that you see, or appalled at the shooting of an unarmed black man. Empathy starts to talk about how can we take that and have both an emotional and an intellectual response to it. How can we look at it a little bit more critically? And I think as part of that, it's this idea that was so lovely illustrated as well by the last presentation, of that there is something there. And I think in the race to fix places, sometimes we just want to race to make that thing better, and we're doing it out of the best of intentions. But in our race to make things better, we sometimes forget to acknowledge the thing that is there, the pain that is there. And so when we say, oh, yes, we know that was there, but now we're going to put this, and this will change everything, that oftentimes I find people also feel like that's just another way of not honoring their value, not honoring the pain that they have experienced. And so this is an image from Warwick Junction, which is located in Durban, South Africa. A couple years ago, I was asked to serve on a technical advisory team for the Urban Land Institute. They wanted to remake this transportation node. It happens to house 2/3 of all informal street traders in the city. And as hopefully has become an understanding of my rhythm, I went and talked to people and talked to the traders. And one of the things that we found was they felt a lot of pain, because they felt in this desire to remake this node, to build a mall that was actually talked about as helping to lift their incomes because they would be in a proper shop, that it was being ignored, all the things that they went through, all the things that they suffered. The fact that the only reason why they were there in the first place often had a lot to do with apartheid planning and policies. And so they wanted that recognized. And there were stories that came out of these conversations of women, a group of women who cleaned the street because the city had stopped doing that so some time ago. But they wanted their customers to come to a clean space. Or the vegetable sellers that pulled all of the things they sold together once a week to make soup for the patients in the AIDS clinic nearby. Even in the midst of all their pain, they were still doing things that were incredible acts of resilience. And so rather than having the city say, we want to do this for you, they wanted the city to come and just listen and understand both what they had experienced, how they were surviving and hoping to thrive, and how that could be part of the baseline story of what would be done here. So for me, these are what we talk about when we start to look at what is a human-centered city and how might we start to approach some of these problems that we face. On the surface, they're really fairly simple, but I think they have tremendous ability for impact. And hopefully many of the presentations that we've heard today also help to illustrate where that can go. And I would say, as a closing point, I would offer up a challenge. That when we talk about people, we often talk about the people who are going to be the recipients of whatever it is we in this room are going to do. But a couple months ago, I was asked what would be the one piece of advice that I would give to someone who wants to do this kind of work. And I said, the first thing that comes to mind is to be human. I think when we go into these situations as experts, wanting to use our skills to help, sometimes there can be a tendency that we focus so much on what that need is that we're seeing that we forget that we are also coming into the situation with our own baggage, our own privilege, and that is part of the equation as well. And so the only way in which I can get the people that I talk to as part of my projects to open up to me, to share, to trust me, is if I am also willing to be open, I'm also willing to be vulnerable, and I'm also willing to be accountable. So I hope that as you go out into the world and take some of the words of advice that have been given today, that you also reflect on what can you do to also be human, because that should not be a burden that we place on the communities that we work in. And yet, we being part of that problem can actually start to say that we will create that better place, that better society, that better community that we all envision. Thank you.